Throughout English and British history, the majority of kings and queens who have ruled over their people were buried in one of two places. Westminster Abbey is considered the most prestigious of burial sites for the monarchy, and within this incredible site are the remains of Queen Elizabeth I, Henry VII, Mary Queen of Scots, Edward the Confessor, Edward I, and many more former rulers, some good and some bad. There is also St George's Chapel within the walls of Windsor Castle, and here, interred inside of a central vault, are Henry VIII, the notorious six-wifed Tudor king, and the executed, losing Civil War king, Charles I. But also around them are the remains of many other monarchs, including Queen Elizabeth II, the longest reigning monarch, Edward IV and Henry VI, who were bitter foes during the Wars of the Roses, but there are a number of former kings and queens who were not actually buried inside of St George's Chapel or Westminster Abbey, and it is increasingly unlikely that their bones and corpses will ever be moved into these. Some have been laid to rest inside of tombs and vaults for centuries, but where are these other burial vaults, and were they ever opened? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. To begin with, many of the former Norman kings who ruled England from 1066 were actually repatriated back to France following their deaths. This included William I, or William the Conqueror, whose remains were actually destroyed over the centuries, but his tomb survived. One place that did become a royal burial site was Winchester Cathedral, and William II, or William Rufus, was buried underneath the tower. When William the Conqueror took control of England, a huge Norman cathedral was built in Winchester, the former Anglo-Saxon capital, as a symbol of the new order. William Rufus, or William II as mentioned, was buried here. He was buried inside of a tomb which was rather plain in its decoration, and has been described as under a plain, flat marble stone before the lecture in the choir. It's believed that his remains were later moved to one of the number of mortuary chests within the abbey, alongside the remains of King Canute, as the royal bodies here were rearranged. Today, these remains lie mixed with others on one of the screens within the cathedral. King Henry I, following his death, was buried inside of Reading Abbey in Berkshire, and this was once a huge abbey which was founded by the king, and it was one of the most prosperous sites across England. However, following the dissolutions of the monasteries, the site became a ruin and fell into disrepair, but the king's remains lost within the site somehow and may have been stolen or taken. There was a tradition that he was buried in a silver coffin, and in 1785 a vault and a lead coffin were found, and it was considered that this belonged to Henry I. Parts of a stone tomb were also found in the following centuries, and there is still investigations being conducted into Reading Abbey today to find his remains. King Stephen is considered one of the monarchs who plunged England into civil war, and his reign was plagued by a period known as the Anarchy. Following his death, he was buried inside of Faversham Abbey in Kent, and he was interred inside of a subterranean vault. But Faversham Abbey was demolished, and there were a rumour that the bones of Stephen were thrown into a nearby river. But the abbey was excavated in 1964, and deep pits identified parts of a royal tomb, possibly containing the remains of the king, but this was covered over by a school and housing, meaning that the remains of one of England's worst kings could be buried under your home if you live locally. King John is another man considered one of the worst men to have ruled over England. He was forced to sign the Magna Carta, but after retreating to Newark Castle, he died from what is believed to be dysentery in the year 1216. John's body was embalmed and was buried in monk robes, with his heart being placed in a gold vessel. The body was placed inside of a stone coffin with a round headspace for the king's remains, and he was placed, to begin with, in the floor of the Lady Chapel of Worcester Cathedral. But in 1232, his body was moved to a new location in front of the high altar, and the tomb would later, during the reign of King Henry VIII, be rebuilt, but this was desecrated during the English Civil War. Another tomb was then built for John, but the body had been disturbed and both of his jawbones had been taken away and broken off, meaning that his remains had also been desecrated. As mentioned, he was not buried in any form of royal regalia, but instead in the robes of a monk. When his body was examined, it was claimed that all the skin and flesh had been eaten by maggots and other insects who had gained access to the tomb. King Edward II abdicated the throne and was locked up inside of Berkeley Castle, where he was murdered, reportedly, on the 20th of January 1327. He was intended to be buried inside of Westminster Abbey. However, this was said to have been not acceptable, and instead he was interred inside of the much lower status cathedral in Gloucester. His tomb is often described as one of the most beautiful in England, and it features an effigy as well as many symbols relating to King Edward I. The king's outer wooden coffin was opened on the 2nd of October 1855, but the inner lead coffin case was not disturbed, meaning his remains possibly may still be in a good way because of the embalming process and the fact he would have been wrapped tightly in a cerecloth. Now often considered one of the greatest cathedrals in England, Canterbury Cathedral houses the remains of Henry IV. Henry was taken ill whilst praying at the Confessor's Chapel in Westminster Abbey, and he died on the 20th of March 1413. You would have thought that the place of death would become his resting site, but Henry was buried on the west side of the Trinity Chapel in Canterbury, presumably because there was now a lack of space for the kings to be buried around the shrine of Edward the Confessor. Work was done in the 19th century to confirm that the king's body was inside of the cathedral, and a body belonging to presumably Henry IV was found, and part of the cerecloth wrapping his remains was taken away, and it was found that his hands and face were perfectly preserved. His nose had shrivelled during the examination, but his beard was still visible on his chin. The body was then rewrapped and resealed in the tomb. King Richard III is one of the most notorious kings to have ever ruled over England. He lost the Battle of Bosworth Field after he was slain on the battlefield, and his remains were then taken into the city of Leicester. He was placed on public display for some time so that the subjects could see that their former king was dead. His body was then, to begin with, interred in a tomb inside of the Greyfriars Priory, but over the centuries this fell into ruin after it was dissolved by Richard's body remained in the ground, before it was discovered in 2012 inside of a car park in Leicester. Today, Richard's body is controversially interred inside of Leicester Cathedral, with his remains inside of a coffin made by one of his descendants, and today a large stone monument marks the site of his burial. Now we must also mention that the Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula inside the Tower of London is a site of royal burial. Two of Henry VIII's wives, Queen Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, are buried here, but these were consorts. There is a Queen Regent who is buried here, this being the 9-day Queen, Lady Jane Grey, who should probably be remembered as Queen Jane. Jane lost her head inside the Tower of London, a victim of Mary I, and her body was placed in a shallow grave in the chapel, but it was later discovered and was moved underneath the altar. The next monarch to be buried somewhere other than Westminster or St. George's came centuries later, as in 1701 King James II died in exile after giving up his throne. Because he died in France, his body was buried in the chapel of St. Edmund Church of the English Benedictines in Rue Saint-Jacques in Paris. It was placed inside of a wooden coffin enclosed by a lead outer shell and another outer wooden coffin which was covered in black velvet. James II's organs were removed and were distributed all around of Paris, with the brain and heart being sent to different places. But during the French Revolution, his coffin was broken into and the body was left exposed for a lady, and it was relatively well preserved. It was then taken away and was probably thrown inside of a common pit, like the remains of other French kings were. George I was not buried in England either. His remains following his death were repatriated to Germany, where they were placed inside of the Chapel of Lane Castle in Hanover. They were later moved from the crypt to the Welfen Mausoleum at Herrenhausen in December of 1957. He had been moved because the castle was badly damaged by British bombing during World War II. The final monarch who was not buried inside of the two largest sites was Queen Victoria. She wanted a special mausoleum created for her within the grounds of Frogmore in Windsor, nearby to St George's Chapel. What was built was the Royal Mausoleum, and it was planned by Victoria for this to be the site of burial for all of her children, but none of them opted to be buried alongside their mother, who was placed inside of a huge tomb at the centre of the building. Alongside her is, of course, her husband, Prince Albert, but the remaining crypt is empty. Next to the mausoleum is also the royal burial ground, a place which will become more populated with the deaths of members of the current royal family over the decades, and it's likely due to space inside of Westminster and St George's becoming scarce, the more royals that are buried there. The only king as of date buried here is Edward VIII, the man who abdicated the throne in favour of marriage with Wallis Simpson. There are many other royal burial sites scattered all across England, Scotland and Wales, containing the remains of princes and princesses from centuries before. As it becomes increasingly more difficult to bury people inside of Westminster or St George's, it's more likely that Frogmore will be utilised by the royal family to bury their loved ones and the future kings or queens. Elizabeth II commissioned a special extension chapel to St George's to inter her father and mother's bodies, as well as hers. The vault here is known to have been full. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.